In this chapter, we'll be looking at the topic of implementing, managing, and maintaining name resolution. Earlier on, we've set the table a little bit. We've talked about the namespace. We've talked about fully qualified domain names. And we've talked about TCP/IP. So we've laid the groundwork for computers to communicate with each other. For humans to use computers to talk to each other, we use host names. And in order for those hosts to be used for computer communication, they must first be resolved to IP addresses. All of the modules in this chapter revolves around that task. So how does your computer resolve a host name? For example, when you log on to a domain, you have to resolve the domain to an IP address. You have to find a domain controller in that domain so that you can submit your logon credentials to that computer. When you browse an internet site, you have to resolve the fully qualified domain name of that site, unless you know the IP address, of course, but typically you don't. You have to resolve that FQDN to an IP address for computer communication to take place, because computers like numbers, humans, though, like these names. How does this work? Here is the order in which a client tries to resolve a name to an IP address. It starts with a check of the local cache, and the local cache can be looked at by opening up a command prompt and typing ipconfig and then display DNS is the command. /. This will show you the DNS cache. So right now there's only a couple of records in the DNS cache, but every time you browse a website, every time you communicate with another computer, that record of name to IP address will be stored in the DNS cache on the local machine. Barring resolution there, if that is unsuccessful, then your computer checks its hosts file. And the host file is just a static file, an ASCII text file that maps IP addresses to host names, or actually host names to IP addresses. The location of the host's file is Windows directory, your system root directory, system32, drivers, and etc. Here are a series of files that help resolve names to IP addresses. The host file, and actually the entire internet was actually kept at one time in a single file called the host file. This listed all of the hosts on the internet, so this file can still be used, and its directory location of etc is a holdover from the Unix environment. But for example, here are a couple things that you can use. These are remark. Pound signs mean it's just a remark. The computer doesn't pay attention to that. But for example, you can list an IP address and then the fully qualified domain name. So here's another way which your computer can try to resolve a host name using the hosts file. Barring successful resolution for a host file, and remember as well that an incorrect entry in the host file will cause incorrect name resolution, because if an entry is found, it will use that even if it's incorrect. Then the computer will check its DNS server, its configured DNS server. And that's what we deal with throughout this entire chapter, how to configure and manage that DNS server. The DNS server can keep a dynamic database of names to IP addresses. If unsuccessful at the Win server, your computer, if configured to do so, will ask its configured Win server. Now, a Win server maps just NetBIOS names to IP addresses, uses a flat namespace, and it does this by taking the leftmost portion of a fully qualified domain name and maps it and tries to request it to an IP address. Let me see if I can find an example here. Here's an example after I've gone out and browsed a couple of websites and then ran the command display DNS again. If we are looking for our WINS server, if we're looking in the WINS server for name resolution, we're going to turn the leftmost portion of the fully qualified domain name into a request for WINS resolution. Try to get an IP address that way. If that's unsuccessful, then the host will try to broadcast. In other words, it just shouts out to all computers on the subnet, hey, do you have this name? If so, if you are this computer name, please send me your IP address. As a last resort, the computer will check its lmhosts file. And the lmhost file resolves NetBIOS names. So again, this is a last resort. lmhosts.sam, select program from a list to open it up. You can open it up in Notepad. It also is an ASCII text file, and its job is to take IP addresses and map them to names. Notice here that these names are flat. There's no designation of a DNS namespace, and also by default there is nothing configured in the LM host file. These are all remarks here. So it is unlikely you'll be tested on this exact process, but it's certainly very important to understand that there are lots of ways to resolve a host name. We just focus in this course and as we prepare mostly on the DNS server. Also, understanding this list and knowing the order can help a lot of times in troubleshooting name resolution. Is there an incorrect entry in the cache? Is there an incorrect entry in the host file? Do our DNS servers, are they up? Do they have the correct information? Is there a possibility that we're using WinServer, Broadcast, LM host, etc.? So, knowing this will give you a leg up for troubleshooting. It will also help you understand topics as we move throughout the rest of this chapter.